Today, I welcome Tim Mosso back to the show for a long overdue catch up. We recognize his birthday and do a deep dive into the bike he gifted himself. We, of course, host a robust crossover of cars and watches in this chat. We discuss the Watchbox rebrand to the 1916 company, things Tim takes part in you may not be aware of, and we wrap things up discussing the release of the Patek Cubitus and how the future may be different than we think. I'm your host, Wesley Smith, and you're listening to the Standard Age Podcast. Tim Mosso.
Wesley, good to see you.
Good to see you. You have a beanie on. Is it chilly in the office? Are they scrimping on the heat?
Yeah, a little bit. I figured I'd use my Gelfer beanie so people know I ride.
Oh, wow. Man, that's quite the graphic on the back. That's amazing.
That's kind of wild, right?
Yeah, that's super cool. Good to see you, man. How are things going?
Things are going well. It's good to be back. We just got back from New York. We did another collector conversation the other day, and this guy he was Russian, so he had long stories to tell. It wound up being two collector conversations. We're gonna have to cut it in half.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. There's an old joke, Russians tell long stories, and this guy lived up to billing, so.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that was a stereotype, but I guess there is a lot of history there.
Like one of those folklore type of stereotypes, I think.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, it was worthwhile. He had some really fun pieces, and he really kind of went his own way. He had stuff from Fernando Ronzon, Dietrich. I mean, he's got the new Toledano and Chan B1. Very, very big into fascinating micro brands. He had a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah.
One is so exclusive. Fernando Ronzon, no one's even heard of him. He's a Mexican watchmaker who works in Canada. The only two people I've ever seen who had this watch, this guy and Aldous Hodge, and that's it.
Oh, okay. That's crazy. I saw that Aldous has his show on, which is pretty cool. And I don't remember who posted what about it, but I just remember putting my comment on. I was like, man, there's going to be some sick watches in this show.
Yeah, and we're all waiting for him to launch his watch. So, I mean, I've seen it. I know what it looks like. I've known what it looks like for 2 years now, but we haven't seen the launch. And I don't know what he's waiting for because the last I heard, he was just saying, I got some projects I want to finish up before I launch the watch. And then it was like, well, the box and the papers, it's been a big pain in the butt designing the box and the papers. So I guess he's getting to it at his pace, but it's a collaboration with Andreas Streller. I guess that's sort of the back end engineering and watchmaking. Streller's good. I think Aldous just wants to do this on his terms, but I haven't seen him since Dubai Watch Week last November, so he might be closer to launching now than I think.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said, for ending one thing and beginning a next. And even though that has, I guess, persisted behind the scenes as he's continued to act and such, I think it's like, all right, let me just feel settled outside of this, film project or TV show project so that I can really focus on promoting the watch potentially.
Yeah, I think what's going on more than anything is when you do movies and TV, you also do a lot of promotions.
Yeah.
And I think he would like to be able to dedicate as much time and travel to promoting the watch as he is obligated to devote to the movies.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, we'll see where that goes. But I'm excited. I told him when you're ready to talk about it, we'll do another collector conversation. And he doesn't want to be seen as a collector these days. He wants to be seen as a designer. And I just want to let him know you could be both. Like I know
Yeah.
you're just on launching your watch, but when I saw Philippe Dufour, he was talking about how much he loved Tudor and Rolex and Lange. And I don't think he's any less a creator as Philippe Dufour because he likes these other brands and he talks about them and he owns them.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's an incredibly fair statement as well. I had no idea. I guess, was that online somewhere or you guys just had a personal
Oh no, I
conversation?
spoke to him in person. It was
Okay.
also by Watch Week.
Okay. Got it. Got it. Yeah. I was like, that's a video I'd like to see.
Yeah, I got it on video. So if you go back to my 2019 interview with Philippe Dufour, he goes through, I ask him what has impressed you aside from your own work, what's caught your eye, and Without hesitation, Rolex, Tudor, Longa. There's the Duforograph, the 403031 Dotograph in rose gold. He loves that people call it the Duforograph. He's not sheepish about it at all. He embraces it. So,
Oh wow, that's cool. Yeah, no, I'll definitely do that digging. That's well worth the dig. Um,
Dubai, are you doing Dubai Watch Week next year?
I would kill to go. I don't know what when is it? Is it
It moves around inside November. It's always November, but I think what they did was after the last time, they decided that they weren't going to let it overlap with the American Thanksgiving holiday. And they realized that you're going to have a lot lower attendance if it overlaps with Thanksgiving.
totally?
So I think they pushed it to the first half of the month of November. I just got back from Horology Forum 10, which is like their off year event that they do when they're not doing the odd year event in Dubai. So
Right.
19, 21, 23, they did Dubai Watch Week. Even years, they did New York in 2022. That was Horology Forum 9. I was in a debate on that one. And then they signed me up for a solo speech at 10 in Hong Kong this year. And I just got back from that about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, you gave me a quick preview of your speech when I was there in Philly. God, it's been a little over a month, I think now, hasn't it?
I think it's been a little bit over a month even since the video went up, and it did very well. The response was excellent. The viewership was voluminous, and I was incredibly happy.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. No, well, so I mean, I guess we could start there as well, like first of all, major thank you for hosting me. I had an absolute blast. I think I'd even said on either a previous episode and or Instagram or something, just like the hospitality there in the office was just it was palpable. Like it was really lovely and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. It was an honor to have you, and I know how you travel pretty far, so we wanted to make sure you got your money's worth. So yeah, I hope to see you at Dubai next year. I'll keep you abreast of what's going on.
Yeah, please. You had a big birthday this year. Happy birthday, 2024, the big 40. So what did you do to celebrate outside of? And I want to hear about the new bike. Although I've had a glimpse, of conversation, but for our listener. And then I want to say that weren't you discussing a watch as well?
It's kind of interesting because the bike started off as just, I guess, a faint notion, maybe 10 years ago. I started
Yeah.
thinking about building a new bike, and it's a road bicycle, a racing type bike. And it just seemed like every 18, 24 months, there was some meaningful new technology coming on board. It's like the last 10 years have seen more changes in bikes than probably the 40 years that came before. So, wireless electronic drivetrains, disc brakes, tubeless tires that run sealant full time. I've got a power meter, a transmission system, and a bike computer, and they all use apps for configuration. I've got three app-dependent technologies on the bike. It's made of aluminum, carbon fiber, and titanium. And so a deep dish, wide carbon fiber wheels. Initially 17 was a wide wheel internal. That became 19, that became 21, and then 25 started popping up as people started buying these gravel bikes. So
Right.
you might have one wheel set for use off-road and on. So eventually I was able to go from a tire that was about the size of my thumb to a tire that looks like it belongs on a moped. And I've got so much compliance, and disc brakes are a new feature that weren't available when I first started thinking about a new bike. So I felt like enough had changed that unless I wanted to wait till I was 50 to do this, I just had to order a bike. So I went with Seven out of Massachusetts, and they do titanium and they do carbon fiber titanium. And I went with carbon fiber titanium. It's a 622XX. And I probably spent way too much money on really light alloy and carbon parts from Italy and Germany. And I thought that was going to make the bike really light, but I realized once you've got really huge tubeless tires and sealant and electronic drivetrains and deep dish wheels, it winds up being about the same weight as my old bike.
Sure.
Capable.
So, you said Italian. So, are you running Campy or what? What are you running?
I'm not running the Campy because it seems like I did wait to see the new Campagnolo this year. So Super Record came out. This is Super Record EPS wireless. And the problem for me is that it's got SRAM style gearing, Shimano style shifting, and Campagnolo pricing. It's like the worst of all possible worlds.
Wow.
So for the premium they're asking, it just didn't make sense. And look, they had a 2 year head start, or I guess they had 2 years to study Dura-Ace before they launched theirs. And it's not necessarily better than Dura-Ace 9200. So I
Hmm.
went with 9200. I tried to include as many American parts as I could. So I had a Lightning Cycle Dynamics carbon crank made, the American frame, American rims from Envy Composites, American
Nice.
King titanium bottle cages. And I just tried to put as much American-made stuff as I could on the bike. And so I was able to take even a little bit more weight out. And with the Lightning crank, I was able to get the full 9200 Shimano group set to weigh less than the new SRAM Red and Campy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like I haven't given up anything. The bike's a racing bike. It's got stuff I never imagined. Aerodynamic wheels, they're Envy, really blunt trailing edge. And the idea there is that they've got a huge stall angle. So if you got crosswinds, you're not going to get that feeling that the handlebars are jerking out of your hands. And I also got the disc brakes, of course, which give you a lot more braking power, which is why I'm wearing this Galfer cap right here. It's not actually for motorcycle parts. They make bicycle parts too.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, Galfer, they're a Spanish company. They make Spanish-made bike parts, and bikes are both bicycles and motorcycles. I like both personally.
Sure.
This cap was because they had to delay my order by 2 weeks, so they wound up hooking me up with a free cap and a free keychain. I'm like, okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, so the bike is like if this were a watch, this bike would be like getting a full custom Debitoon.
Sure.
Every option, every type of personalization, bespoke in every way. And we went all the way with this. I mean, right down to anodized aluminum cage bolts. And I've got titanium bolts on the stem and the faceplate and the steerer tube. I've got all THM cockpit, bar, seat post, and stem. And like I said, I probably spent way too much on this. There's a reason why I just did a bike and not a bike and a car for my 40th birthday. I'm tapped out for this model year, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. Well, you said anodized. So what color did you anodize the parts?
Everything's neon green.
Oh, sick. Well, yeah, yeah, green is very Tim Mosso, I would say.
It's all neon green or it's black carbon fiber, which is a great look.
Oh man, I can't wait to see photos of this thing. I absolutely can't wait. How many miles are on it? You've been riding a lot?
I got it right at the beginning of May, and I had a goal to get 2,000 miles on it before I folded shop for the winter and moved to rollers indoors. I
Sure.
got 2,013 miles on it between May and the beginning of November, so I got my money's worth.
Wow. So when you're on your rollers in the winter, though, are you using a previous bike for that?
I use a bike that my friend crashed years ago, and
Okay.
so it's really not suitable for the road anymore because it could break in half at any time.
Oh
But
no.
on the rollers, watching like the 24 hours of Daytona, I've got like 15 years of the Daytona 24 to watch on YouTube. So I figure between all of these like 60 to 90-minute workouts, by the time we get to the actual 24 hours of Daytona late next January, I will be ready to like start the clock again, watch that 24. That'll bridge me to like Sebring, and I'll pretty much have WEC, Formula One, and the IMSA WeatherTech series. So I watch racing while I'm riding my bike. People think I'm watching like, wristwatch YouTube or something. No, it's always cars, always cars.
Yeah, and that's such a great type of content to watch because it's sort of constant. You don't have to think too much about it. Like if you're watching watch content, like and you miss a detail or something, you're like, wait, what kind of escapement does that have? Or like what have you? And it's like I think that's a brilliant plan, man. I think it also just like sounds fun when you can't obviously get outside to ride. It's a way to make it fun.
Yeah, so if I know that like my local ride, my 30 miler, if I know that that's a 1300 kilojoule workout, I've got a power meter on that indoor bike, so I can make sure I get 1300 kilojoules in the same amount of time and it's the same workout. So it's
Sure.
great to have something that's energetic like racing cars as opposed to some guy pontificating for, 70 minutes about some watch. Any watch video, in my opinion, that goes past 20 minutes is catastrophically run on. Like that's sort of my attitude with watch videos. You got to get it done quickly. They take a long time to make. They should not take a long time to explain. If you can't do it in 20 minutes, you can't do it. It's like years ago, John Five, guitarist for Rob Zombie, and before that for Marilyn Manson. He worked for David Lee Roth during the 90s when Roth was kind of like on the downslope of his career. And Roth told him, like, if you can't do it in two takes, you can't do it when they were in the studio.
Wow.
That's how I feel about watch videos. If you can't do it in 20 minutes, you can't do it. Like, you got to be able to distill what's important. It should take more time to make than to explain. That's like the rule.
Wow, that's funny because like I know David Lee Roth as somewhat of a perfectionist, but I guess when you're paying for studio time too, there's a efficiency needed, you know.
Yeah, and I have to say that considering, John Five was working for Roth in like 95, 96, by that point, Roth's music was probably kind of at its low ebb, and I don't know how much money his label was giving him for studio time at that point. I think when he said if you can't do it in two shots, that's probably exactly what the studio told him. If you
Right.
can't do it, if you can't do it in two takes, we're not paying for it.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of musicians well into their careers. I guess they oftentimes will self-fund it. I think, you know, and kind of ditch the label, so to speak.
Yeah, the problem was like, and I'm going so far off topic. We're supposed to be on like watches and cars.
No, we're supposed to just be chatting. That's what this is about.
Yeah, but like at his peak, David Lee Roth, when he left Van Halen, he had Steve Vai on lead guitar and he had Billy Sheehan on bass. Like that kind of crew costs money. I got to assume he
Yeah.
didn't have that money by the mid 90s. Even Van Halen was kind of on kind of at the low tide point of the Van Halen journey. I think Eddie had a big comeback before his death, unfortunately, and I just missed seeing him live, which would have been incredible because there was
Mm.
talk that they were going to do a twin bill in arenas, and there was going to be an alternating set between Sammy and Dave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that Michael Anthony was going to come back on bass and split time with Wolfgang. Like it was going to be incredible. But back in the 1990s, if you weren't like hip hop or grunge, you weren't getting a lot of money from the studios. The A&R guys was not giving, they weren't giving you big contracts. Just about the only hard stuff I can think of from the 90s that was still going strong back then, like Alice in Chains or like White Zombie. Like that was great back then.
Yeah.
That was it. Everyone else was grunge. It was, things like Nirvana and
Stone Temple Pilots and yeah.
exactly. Pearl Jam. It was rock. It was still rock, but it wasn't hair on fire, big guitar, big drum 80s style, which I have to admit I kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, then if you go like a slightly deeper cut, you could throw in Danzig, but like only for Mother, you know, like it was kind of a one hit wonder type of thing.
Yeah, like the D Danzig and his crew. It's kind of funny because I really like comics, and that's actually where he comes from. Like that was his first project. He was in high school. He was drawing all these comics that weren't suitable for children, and he got out and he wanted to be, a illustrator of comics that no one at the time, I guess the indie labels like Dark Horse weren't really signing this stuff up back then, but he had to create his own comic label because so much of the stuff was adult oriented and explicit, and it was a lot more, shall we say, risque than his music.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's exactly like where he came from. He came from comics.
I had no idea. That's crazy.
Oh yeah. Evil Elvis. He started out as a comic book entrepreneur.
Okay, all right. So that name does ring a bell. I'm not surprised, Tim, but you have such deep knowledge in so many subjects, and I know that you are into music because we've touched on this before. But I don't know. Did I ever ask you? Have you? Do you play an instrument?
I do play guitar.
I
Yes.
was gonna say you're a strings guy, like on some level. You're either on a guitar or you're like sick with it on a violin. Like,
No, no. There's a time and a place for rock and roll violin. Other than like Charlie Daniels, it's tough to work that in. Like you got to have a real imagination to make that work. I think the more I've never heard anyone play rock and roll harpsichord, but you can get a keyboard in there, you can get a
right,
piano,
right.
and you can get a trumpet in there. Some instruments I think don't once you start getting into things that involve a bow, you got to be pretty country fried to make that work with rock.
Yeah, I mean, you do have the glimpse of Dave Matthews Band, of course, but as far as guitars go, when did you pick that up? How old were you?
I didn't start playing guitar until I was in my late 30s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was Buck Dharma of the Blue Oyster Cult who inspired me to actually start. And I love Buck. Buck, in my opinion, is the greatest and most underrated guitarist who's ever been. Go find a live performance from the 70s of Astronomy, and you'll get a song that is fundamentally maybe 2.5 minutes of lyrics, but the extended play is like 6 minutes plus, and it's all him freestyling on the guitar.
Wow.
That is greatness, being able to double the length of a song with non-repetitive, original guitar soloing. He was amazing. Like people know him for Don't Fear the Reaper, Burnin' for You, and Godzilla. He wrote all their hits. So as a lyricist and a singer, he's probably better known to the public. But as the lead guitarist of the band, oh my gosh, I would put him up against anyone. I've seen them in concert today. And Buck and their younger guitarist, Richie Castellano, they do guitar battles in the middle of the show. And I've seen them many times, so I know it's not like a set piece. It's always a freestyle guitar battle.
Oh,
And
wow.
I've never seen Richie beat Buck.
Wow.
Richie plays with him every night and he knows what's coming and he still can't beat him. Buck Dharma inspired me to pick up the guitar, and he's a great rhythm guitarist. He's a great lead guitarist. He's a great lyricist. He's a great singer. But as a guitarist, I think so much invention and originality and virtuosity. And I do think he is that. He's a virtuoso.
Wow.
Formal training, completely self-instructed. And so I saw that he was able to do that basically from nothing. And I guess from one Long Islander to another, we're both from Long Island. It kind of was my inspiration. Now, I love hard rock, and I think probably the Blue Oyster Cult that I love is not the cult that you hear on classic rock radio.
Sure.
I like the hard rock stuff. I like the proto metal stuff. I like the stuff with, well, I like Buck's lyrics. I like Buck's vocals, but I think that there's a harder edge to the songs like Astronomy or This Ain't the Summer of Love, where some of the other lyricists come in.
Mm-hmm.
Really love that. I think I love him most on lead guitar. Although eye-popping, he can play lead while he's singing. I can't do that.
Right, right.
I can play rhythm while I'm singing. I cannot play lead while I'm singing. It's bonkers stuff. But he also got me into guitars. So, I've got a DC 135 from Carvin. And so Buck inspired me to start playing, but it was actually Jason Becker who inspired me to go out and buy a Carvin. And I bought one for 400 bucks off of eBay. And I guess everything comes back to Long Island. It was in Syosset when I was in Florida. So I'm originally from, that area.
Sure.
For 400 bucks, I got a guitar that was so out of time. It's a super strat. It's got, a single, double, like humbucker pickup.
Okay.
It is a hardtail. It doesn't have a Floyd Rose. That would be really cool, but I can't set up a Floyd Rose, and I'm sure only a few people can. So I'm glad it just stays in tune. It's got Spurzl locking tuners. It's got neck through construction. It's got a really wide radius neck with a broad fretboard, but it's so old that the frets are almost flat now. And, fun wristwatch tie-in. Most guitar frets are made of the same stuff as a Longa movement.
Is that right? German silver?
Yeah, if you ever notice the guitar frets, they're sort of a pale champagne color.
Yeah, they are.
Material, nickel, copper, and zinc.
Wow.
Same stuff, but when I get this thing refretted, I'm going with stainless steel, so I never have to do frets again.
I see. Is that expensive to replace them?
I mean, everything's a few $100 when you go to a luthier.
Yeah.
If the difference is like 200 versus $400, like I couldn't care less.
Yeah.
Guitar 7 years ago, I got my money's worth.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sending it back. It's an American made guitar. It's funny because I never intended this, but my show that I do on YouTube, like economic nationalism has become like an undercurrent. I've got American made watches showing up now. I've got American made guitars. I've got American made cars. And I've got an American made bike. And I've got two American made bikes.
Yeah.
I never intended it that way, but I always admired you for making so much of your standard H kit in the United States.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, no, it was really important for me because it's like, I, I mean, yes, there's like the patriotic aspect of it, of course, and keeping jobs here, of course, but it's also sort of this like, as somebody who loves to burn fuel, it was a way that I could sort of argue that there is a carbon footprint awareness to my life, and that, and then also quality control. If something goes awry, it's right up the street. You know what I mean? So that was super important for those reasons, for sure. But thanks for saying so.
Oh yeah, and I totally know what you mean. Like, look, I love cars and I love burning stuff, but at the same time, I do think you have to live a life in balance. I love
Sure.
pizza too. It doesn't mean I eat it every day. I love a lot of things. Fossil fuel powered cars, bourbon and pizza and ice cream, and you got to go easy on all these things to have a
Right.
life balance. So I walk to work. I've got a Chevy Volt, but then again, I've also had Corvettes, I've had V8s, I've had Audi S8, TTRSs, turbocharged to next year. And yeah, I like the fact that there's a little bit of balance in there. And I also think it's kind of cool because one of the reasons that you build in the US is because it's where you live.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think we all learned during the pandemic that if you have a problem with something coming over from Asia, you're talking months of turnaround to get the next batch. This is
Yep.
coming over on a ship, and the
Yep.
ship is not the Queen Mary 2. It's not steaming along at 30 knots. So if there's a problem like with bike parts or with auto parts, if there's any kind of delay, you've lost a model year.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that because I've been talking to a couple of friends of mine, both sales guys for two different brands, same umbrella. One's at Porsche, one's at Audi, and they both have talked about model years. I think it was the Cayenne and then the Q5, I think next year. So the 2025s are starting to come through, but then they're doing like a redesign for a 25 and a half, which is not uncommon, but not common. And it's funny that they would do like a complete redesign for a half model year. But rumor has it, it has everything to do with supply chain and how it's still wacky due to COVID.
Yeah, supply chains never really recovered completely.
Right.
I think there was also some premium pricing that became just a fact of the matter. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
never going back to what it was. Now, in terms of changing suppliers, I know exactly how that can work out because when Messina Lab and Ming did their collaboration, the
Mm-hmm.
watches were being made by Schwarz-Etienne, but there was a hitch where Schwarz-Etienne designed the watch to use a certain component, and at the last minute, the supplier had to switch specifications. And so there were all those problems with that Masena Lab Ming collaboration. And some people blamed Masena, some people blamed Ming. And then everyone who knew a little bit more blamed Schwarz Etienne for building the watch. But the reality was one part in the movement changed. And
Huh.
the supplier that failed to deliver the part to the correct spec blew up the entire collaboration. And I spoke to the CEO of Schwarz Etienne, and he confirmed it was one part from one supplier. And so if you are building a car and let's say your wiring harness is made in Ukraine
Well, yeah,
and
there
there's
you
an
go.
invasion of
Yeah.
Ukraine, yeah, all of a sudden at a bare minimum you need to find another supplier. And if that supplier doesn't make the part the same way, then you've got like these dominoes that start falling. You wind up with a modified car that needs to be re-engineered. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, absolutely, especially when you're dealing with something like an electric car. I'm almost 100% certain those are not Porsche's cells. So they're at the mercy of suppliers on that front.
Yeah,
But yeah,
totally.
cars are global products. I mean, even today, I was looking at the Polestar ones because I love them to death. It's
Yeah, it's a great car. That's so cool. I love it. My friend in Portland, Oregon has one.
and It's like a Swedish Chinese Aston Martin. But you look at the window sticker in that car, and you've got an engine from Sweden, along with all the engineering and design. You've got a transmission from Japan. The car is made in Chengdu, China, and its primary market was the United States. So you've got this car that is scattered across the four corners of the world in terms of sourcing and design and manufacture.
Yeah.
So you better believe that if you've got a supply chain issue, I don't care how vertically integrated you are, unless you're Rolex, you got to ask someone else for parts. And that's whether you're in the watch industry or the car industry. But
Yeah.
I love cars to pieces. The way watches are today, you know, I don't know where the industry is heading, and I'm gonna be totally honest about that. I know everyone would like to be what Audemars Piguet is, which is fully vertically integrated. They own all their retail and they own their production. But at the same time, we're seeing more independent brands springing up in places where they never did before. China, Japan, the United States, France, Britain, Germany, Russia. We're seeing, I think, a diffusion of production.
Mm.
And people are still getting started with Longines. They're still getting started with Oris. They're still getting started with Baume& Mercier. But more and more, we're seeing, especially when you go to a place like Dubai Watch Week, these constructors are from all over the place.
Yeah.
And I feel like the era of the big luxury group was like the 2000s and the 2010s. And if anything, we might see divestment going forward. Kering decided it wanted nothing to do with watchmaking. It sold Gerard Perregaux and Ulysse Nardin. And when you look at the groups like Richemont and Swatch and LVMH, there's a lot of overlap there.
Well, didn't Richemont just take investment from LVMH or something like that, like a minority stake?
Yeah. That's sort of the way things are going. But I mean, like in terms of how they're structured, do you
Hmm.
really six different brands that all have tourbillon?
Right.
It's the kind of thing where a Baume& Mercier should not have any product overlap with Jaeger-LeCoultre. There should be no product overlap there.
Mm.
Uh, but Baume& Mercier has $20,000 perpetual calendars. And, it's one of those deals where there probably shouldn't be a $20,000 Baume& Mercier perpetual calendar when Jaeger-LeCoultre is selling in that same price range,
Hmm.
including calendar watches. Now, I don't know if LVMH is going to go all the way towards acquiring Richemont. It is one of those things. There's a stake. There has been a stake since the summer. It's been openly acknowledged. But I would say Zenith and Jaeger-LeCoultre kind of appeal to the same person. And I would say Panerai and Hublot kind of appeal to the same person.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I would say the horlogerie, augury pieces, where you're dealing with something that's made at a real artisanal level. It's got a
Hmm.
lot of overlap with the high-end Piagets, with Longo, with Vacheron. And so I scratch my head a little bit, wondering if maybe going forward, these brands are going to say, hey, look, we have all these little maisons that cannibalize each other. And unless we're going to have centrally planned product portfolios, like for example, Lexus and Toyota, those are the only two brands you need. That covers everything from a bare bones plastic interior Corolla
Yeah.
all the way up to, in theory, something priced at a Lexus LFA level. Everything with two
Right.
brands.
Right.
And so I'm not sure you need all these brands. So you start to ask, well, like, who would be interested if, for example, Swatch decides it doesn't need Breguet and Blancpain, or they decide that Jacques Hedreau and Harry Winston are too niche, too low volume, and ill-defined. Or, for example, LVMH realizes that maybe some of these autologerie Daniel Roth and Fabrique du Temps and Louis Vuitton branded watches have too much overlap with the top end of Bulgari. Like there's a lot of duplication going on, and I could see companies from outside the watch space looking to maybe buy these in ones and twos and breaking down the big luxury groups, especially
Do you,
since it seems like all the money is now in jewelry. So if you are at Richemont and you've got Bulgari and Cartier and Buccellati, do you really need all the watchmakers?
this is a fascinating thing that I've never even given a thought to because of your analogy with the automotive, with the two brands. So I think it's twofold. I think there's potentially just too much history in watchmaking to want to like absolve these brands, and maybe ego perhaps as well, depending on who's the owner of the brand or what have you. But what could be interesting is, as and I say this as a complete IWC and a Langenzona stan, is that hypothetically, right? Like, what if everybody does join forces, say within the Richemont group, and a Langenzona almost becomes the model names as opposed to the brand names? You know what I mean? Where like LFA is now the 1815, or they just call it a Langa or whatever. Like I never thought about this one iota. It's a really fascinating thought.
It's definitely, I think the problem is that all of these watchmaking operations have their own factories, their own marketing structures, their own
Right.
executive leadership. Like it would be really hard to break down to the point where they're all basically produced at the same place in the same way. And Lange is a model and Jaeger-LeCoultre is a model. And I'm not sure you want that. I definitely don't want that. I
Hmm.
just think that you can have an assembly line that makes both the Cadillac Vistic and like the Equinox EV. That's a lot easier to do in the auto industry with shared production, shared design bureaus. I do think that these brands start losing some of their appeal if they don't have the inherent organs of a
Hmm.
manufacturer. And I think people can see through that. Like people complain about shared movements. Like they complain about Baume & Mercier and IWC and Panerai all having Volflurier calibers. Can you imagine if they were all made in the same factory? Like that's one of the weaknesses of Ulysse Nardin and Gerard Perregaux right now. People are slowly realizing that they're made in the same place.
Right.
It feels like I'm buying a rebranded version of the other one. Like, what's the difference between a GP and a UN? They seem to play to the same crowd. I know they say they don't. They'll say, well, the Laureato is nothing like the Freak. And I'll be like, yeah, but the Constant Escapement is a lot like the Freak. Like, the guy who buys that also buys a Freak. The price point is the same. They're both watch snob brands. And if they're building out of the same facility, they start to become indistinct. It's like, even Rolex doesn't build Rolex watches in the same factory as Tudor, and they understand that Tudor needs to have its own oxygen and creative space and identity. But the difference is there's a really hard break between the kind of watches Tudor makes and the price point it occupies and the price point Rolex occupies. And I don't think you need shared production to rationalize the model lines. Like I don't think yeah, I mean, there's no reason for Baume & Mercier to have a perpetual calendar that costs as much as a Jaeger-LeCoultre,
Yeah.
or for the Baume & Mercier perpetual calendar to be within an ear's shot of the price of a Vacheron 56 triple calendar. Like
What?
that's hazardous. That's going to create a lot of bloat and gray market inventory.
Sure. Well, what are your thoughts on brands using almost the exact same movement in two different watches at two different price points?
It depends what the price points are. So, for example, if you're selling me two different watches that look completely different, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
A Piaget Polo S chronograph that uses a Cartier chronograph movement,
Hmm.
totally distinct. Where I backtrack a little bit and I start thinking, like, I don't know if I go through with this, is when you have a five figure, 11, 12, $14,000 steel or titanium Ingenieur 40, and it's got the same movement in it as a sub $4,000 Baume & Mercier Riviera. Now it's a little bit harder to swallow because I know that I'm paying a huge premium for branding. Whereas if you're giving me a comparable price point but two very distinct watches, it's very obvious that a Lotus Emira with a AMG 2-liter four-cylinder turbo is nothing like a CLA AMG. Like
Yeah.
same engine, very different cars. I don't think one is necessarily a lot better than the other, but it's two very different experiences. They're both premium brands, that's fine. But if you told me that I would be able to buy like a Smart 42 with that same engine for like 25, 26, 27,000 euro, I would be like, okay, that's going to be unhinged. But also, that kind of damages the more expensive cars and it makes
Yeah.
me question whether I'm paying for branding. If I can get that whole power package in a car that costs 30,000 euro less, 40,000, 50,000 euro less, then I feel like I'm really kind of getting scammed at the high end. So I don't like it when two watches at dramatically disparate price points use the same movement unless something incredible has been done to that movement.
Sure.
If it's handmade, skeletonized, engraved, okay, very different. Like Benzinger on the GAP1 uses the Habring A11, which is itself a non-chrono modified Valjoux 7750. But between the work that Habring does to modify it and then the work that Benzinger does to engrave it, I feel like I'm getting something that's a unique product.
Yeah.
Not like there's just some, unfinished value in there. So
Sure.
depending on how much it's changed or improved, IWC Grand Complication, the 3770 from 1990. What is it? A Valjoux 7750. What does it have? Well, it's a minute repeater, it's a chronograph,
Right.
it's a
Right.
Venturi moon phase, it's a perpetual calendar.
The kitchen sink.
The Valjoux has 25 joules. The IWC has 75. Obviously, changes were made. I'm fine with that. But I think that you've got to have separate factories and different traditions for these Richemont or Swatch brand companies. I just think that if you do have overlapping prices, and that's going to be inevitable, they have to be very different products. And I think there's going to be a lot of overlap between IWC Aquatimers and pilots and Panerai of all description. I think the high-end JLCs are going to have a lot of duplicative perpetual calendar and tourbillon content that confuses the choice between them and Lange and Vacheron. I think that there's going to be a lot of confusion between what a top-of-the-line Longines is and what an entry-level Omega is. And if there is going to be that overlap, the products have to be very different. It can't be like two chronographs and they're almost the same price.
Sure.
So I think it's entirely possible that these big luxury groups going forward focus a lot more on jewelry. That's where all the market is, that's where all the margin is. It's very easy. You don't have to worry about setting up after sales service for these millions of watches that are going to be coming back needing work. And that's
Yeah.
one of the worst parts of the watch ownership experience. And it's one of the things the brands are least willing to invest in at scale. So I would say that if you can get away with just selling jewelry, if you're a Richemont and you can maybe neck down to two or three brands that don't have a lot of overlap, say Baume& Mercier at the bottom because it's very popular in Asia and it's got the right price point to be entry level globally. Then maybe you decide at the mid range that your cash cow has always been Panerai. In terms of profit margin, it's always been Panerai. And then at the very top, you keep one of Vacheron or Lange.
Yeah.
They've already sold off their interest in Grubel Forsey. And, if there ever were to be overlap between Richemont and LVMH,
Right.
my goodness, Zenith and JLC seem like the same buyer at the same price with a lot of the same features. And Tag Heuer has an uncomfortable amount of overlap with the low-end Panerais and Baume& Mercier and the low-end IWCs. And Bulgari and the Haute Horlogerie brands of Richemont are going to step on each other's toes. Plus now Louis Vuitton wants to expand into real high horology watches with Daniel Roth and its own high-end watches made by La Fabrique du Temps. So I wouldn't be shocked if at some point LVMH is just like, look, we make all of our money with leather goods, accessories, travel trunks, and jewelry, booze, and luxury experiences. How much do we really need the watch group?
Right. Right. That's really interesting. What's been your favorite release this year, 2024?
I would say the Chapek Promenade Gutto, which is a lovely watch from Chapek. It's basically the case of their dress watches in a sub 40 millimeter size with an enamel dial that looks like ripples on water. But then on the back, instead of using their usual SXH1 movement, it is the micro rotor automatic from the Antarctique created by Daniel Martinez and Emmanuel Boucher, which is one of the coolest movements launched in the last 5 years. That I adored. I loved that watch to pieces. If it's a sports watch, then this was out towards the end of last year, but it competed in this year's GPHG. So the Streamliner Small Seconds Blue Enamel from Moser and the FB RES from Ferdinand Berthoud, which just pegged the meter. Everything I love about watches in one surprisingly wearable package.
Cool.
Really great pieces. In terms of what I thought was a great value, that's always a lot tougher.
Well, it doesn't have to be about value.
Yeah, yeah, I always like to give a shout out though to something that doesn't cost a ton of money. So I
Yeah.
would say the Tudor Black Bay Chrono Pink.
Oh,
It's the first time I can remember a watch that costs entry level Omega Seamaster money getting as much attention and interest from the entry level buyer and the guy who is on the short list to buy every new Nautilus.
yeah. I was gonna say like a Patek client. Yeah, 100%.
Like, I know that on the OEM side, we got like two to three of them.
Mm-hmm.
I can guarantee you we got more than that number of Aquanauts and Nautilus.
Wow.
You talk about someone wanting this as much as a 911 GT3 allocation at his Porsche dealer, and the Porsche dealer is probably getting more of those than we got as a volume dealer of Tudor of the Black Bay Chrono Pink.
Yeah.
For a watch that was not expensive, it looked really cool, and the exclusivity was a real thing. It was not
Yeah.
some contrived, made up short-term scarcity followed by waves of availability. And
Sure.
I'm happy to say that some of them were sold on a non-prejudicial basis. I did a collector conversation with a dude who walked into a dealer on his birthday, talked to the sales associate, got the watch, and walked out.
That's great.
That was the beginning, middle, and end of the lobbying, and it was completely unplanned. And I know that that dealer got as many of those watches as we did, so that was a genuinely special and cool story.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. You mentioned being a dealer. Obviously, the branding has changed a bit. Sort of transition from Watchbox, say, over to what's now known as the 1916 company. What can you sort of tell us about that name change and how it may or may not have affected the business and how the business has evolved?
It hasn't affected the business. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I still have great sentimental attachment to Watchbox. It was a great
Sure.
name, it's a great
Yeah.
brand,
Yeah.
and I still sometimes call it Watchbox. But officially, we are the 1916 company, and it had to do with suddenly needing to integrate four different brands. So we went out and we got heavily into brick and mortar retail.
Yep.
And we purchased the suite of locations for Hyde Park Jewelers out in Colorado, Scottsdale, and Southern California.
Newport Beach. Yeah.
And they've got a lot of multi-brand and mono-brand stores. And so you've got Hyde Park, but then you've got all those mono-brand one, IWC or whatnot boutiques that sell one brand.
Mm-hmm.
Then we also bought Radcliffe Jewelers here on the Mid-Atlantic East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And the original two companies that were the nucleus for Watchbox were Govberg and Watch You Want. And so the pre-owned branch of Govberg and Watch You Want, which was exclusively pre-owned, they became Watchbox, but Govberg continued to operate. So all of a sudden, we found this need to make it clear that Radcliffe and Hyde Park and Govberg and Watchbox were all one company.
Mm-hmm.
And make it clear to people that if you saw something on our website, you could get it at any of those points of sale.
Oh, cool.
The 1916 company is what they came up with. There was also guidance from some of the watch brands we sell new and certified pre-owned
Mm-hmm.
that in order to be, to get that blessing, it was necessary to have something that was a clean break with our pre-owned past.
Mm-hmm.
And so between having to integrate four brands into one and that incentive to make OEMs happy, We found a name that everyone could agree on, which was the 1916 company, which is the first year that Danny Govberg's, I believe, grandfather created a watch dealer in Philadelphia. So if you
Okay.
take it's like Gerard Perregaux, they talk about 1791, but really it's the company Bout that was established in 1791, and a century later they bought it. So that's what they're really talking about when they talk about 1791. So when we
Mm.
talk about 1916, we are talking about the oldest individual company that went into the combined merged firm. And the oldest individual company in that portfolio was Govberg, 1916. So
Oh,
that's where
cool.
that comes from.
How much writing are you doing today? Obviously, people probably most know you for video, clearly. How much of your time are you spending writing at all?
I like to joke that all I do is write, but it's creative process. So a lot of it's just in my head, but I do write a tremendous amount. I wrote in this year a magazine called Lux Wellington, which was a Friends magazine that he just launched. And then I
Cool.
published one article on a blog to watch, and then 45 times I published on Quill and Pad, full length original photography. Those are all between 1,300 and 2,500 words.
Wow.
I do a lot of writing for Quill and Pad for Ian Skellern. He's a good friend of mine, and it helps to keep my writing chops sharp. So I also did a lot of writing for other people under pseudonyms. So that's gonna sort of remain untold, but
Oh, interesting.
do realize that there is material out there that's mine and not attributed.
So here's an awkward question. Do you get paid by Quill and Pad or any of these other people that you're going under a pseudonym for?
Quill and Pad gives me $150 per article, so I
Okay.
don't do it for the money. Um,
Well,
a more senior writer I spoke to, I'm getting the equivalent of like 10 cents a word from Quill. I spoke to a more senior writer who I know who told me that he was getting $1 a word.
wow.
And so I'm thinking of those 2,500 word articles, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it's like it gives me pause. Like I stare off into the distance, the 1,000 yard stare, and I'm like, I was trying to offset the cost of my bike a little bit.
Sure.
I would have been able to go out and buy myself that Polestar if I were getting paid $1 a word by Ian.
Okay, so let me ask you this, and that's no shade to Ian, of course, but and I'm sure you're happily willing to do those things. But at $1 a word, and let me ask you this: how long would it take you, generally speaking, to write something that's 2,500 words long?
Between taking the pictures, writing it, and walking away, having a coffee, and coming back to proofread it,
Sure.
in one work day, I could put out two of those.
Wow. So you could be making 5 grand a day, hypothetically.
If I made as much as that guy does.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Fair. Um. What? Okay. So I guess this sort of dovetails into my next question because I was like, what do you do that not many people know you do?
Well, aside from the fact that I did a tremendous amount of writing and photography this year, I would say that the macro photographs that I take, if you watch my last episode of Watches Tonight, guys, check me out on the 1916 company, Watches Tonight.
Absolutely.
Dozens and dozens of very close range detail photos of watch movements. I've probably taken more photos of watch movements, dials, and case details at like the 10 to 20 power level this year, more than any other journalist in the industry. And I've
Mm.
got a hard drive of multiple terabytes of high res macro photos that I've taken. And my goal is to just sort of put these up with a scrolling action in a place where people can like listen to classical music and just watch all these, macros of longa movements scroll past.
Yeah.
If I wind up with 250 pictures of a dotograph because I photographed a dotograph for an article, well, 10 of those are going to be used in the article, and that leaves me with 240 that no one's ever seen. And I think I don't send them in if I don't think they're worthy of publication. So they're not failures, they're not first passes, they're good photos that I've spent some time with. Other things I do besides writing, which a lot of people don't realize how much I do write. Let's see. I am an illustrator. I play guitar. I take all those macro photos. I'm not a competitive cyclist, but I still ride for performance and fitness.
Sure.
And I'm learning watchmaking
Oh, cool.
and component finishing.
Nice.
Just recently, I got to a very high level at repairing screws. So let's say you get an old pocket watch, and over time, people have used screwdrivers that are too big for the slots, too small for the slots, not well
Yeah.
sharpened, they slip, they scratch. I've learned to mirror polish the head of the screw to remove all of that boogering and then reslot the screw using a ruby file to restore the sort of chamfered slot to guide the screwdriver in.
Sure.
I've become very adept at restoring damaged screws, and this is just in the last year. I've been through many movement teardowns, diagnosis, and routine services. What I can't do yet is make parts, and I'm really
Right.
waiting for a watchmaking mentor who would take me on. I often say, with no small earnestness, that if a master watchmaker wanted an apprentice and promised to teach me everything he knows, I'd very seriously consider moving on to that because I
Wow.
feel like what I do is trivia. I consider myself a historian of modern watches, but it's like the longer you're in the car business, the more respect you have for engineers,
Mm-hmm.
the more respect you have for the guys who restore the cars up to like a Pebble Beach, the Quail, Greenwich Concours level. Like when
Yeah.
you can take something that is 90 years old, for which parts haven't been made in half a century, and you're able to do the metal work, and you're able to machine the hood ornament from billet, and you're able to reupholster that thing, and you're able to re-pour Babbitt bearings on an engine that doesn't use hydrodynamic, crankshaft and camshaft bearings. That level of craftsmanship, the longer you're around cars, the more you value that and
Mm-hmm.
revere those people. And for me in the watch space, the more I revere the artisans and the craftsmen and the engineers behind these watches.
Yeah. I mean, in the watch topic, like I know you're a jump hour fan. Do you have a favorite jump hour watch?
Yes. The Debatoon DBD. It's a
Okay.
jump hour that's also a digital inline calendar. And it's shaped like a tombstone with a dial like a bathroom scale. It is a very particular watch.
Right. Right.
And so I believe they only sold 39 of the original run in 2006 to 2009, and then only 33 were launched when the DBD was reissued last year.
Mm-hmm.
13 pieces were designed by Kasim Dean, Swiss Beats, and those had black zirconium cases and burgundy dials. And then there were 20 more that were titanium cases with evergreen dials. Beautiful watches, all sold out immediately. And I thought Dean had an incredible eye for detail in the company's history,
Mm-hmm.
that when he was asked for a collaboration, it wasn't the kind of thing you would expect a young recording artist to spec out because he did a series for Zenith and it was all diamonds on everything.
Right.
Tune, first, there were no diamonds whatsoever, but second, he wanted to bring back this incredibly obscure model from 17 years prior. And I had so much respect for both the choice of model and the way it came out. I thought it was masterful. So, in terms of people who really love the DBD, it seems like it's me and it's him and those 33 people who ordered the reedition. So, we're
Right.
so
Right.
proud. Now, there were also some fantastic Pierre Kunz watches that were made chronometer certified with retrogrades and jump hours. And these watches were 100 meters water resistant. And, it's the kind of thing where I felt like compared to what they sold for new, which was deep into five figures back in the 2000s, something like the Pierre Kunz Grand Date or Grand Date, as they say, sport chronometer. The Grand Date was a beautiful watch that had a retrograde display, a chronometer certification, a lacquer dial, 100-meter water resistance, automatic winding, and a jump hour. And this was a brand that was owned by Franck Muller back when Franck had a whole bunch of tenant brands like Rodolphe and Martin Braun and Custos and Pierre Kunz, and they were trying to create their own little watch group. And almost all those brands now have been discontinued and folded back into Franck Muller and Watchland. But the Pierre Kunz Grande Date was a watch that cost like $20,000 and now you can buy for under 10. So while I work on my French R, I'm also going to be saving up for one of those because it's one of the only jump hour watches of which I'm aware that boasts substantial water resistance. If you think about it,
Mm.
jump hours are almost always dress complications. To find one that's 100 meters rated, automatic, and steel, that's
Mhm.
an unusual combination. And that's a really great buy. There's not a lot of them kicking around. They have lacquer red dials, they have lacquer blue dials, a neat piece that I've only encountered once. Other jump hours that I really love, I always loved the Gerald Genta Arena by Retros. And there was one model made in the mid 2000s that had a tantalum and white gold case with a neon green accented dial, retrograde date. It had a retrograde minute and a jump hour, and a Girard Perregaux base that was engine turned and gold gilded. And oh my gosh, this watch. It pushes my wrist to the limit because it's big. But boy would I make the attempt. I've seen that watch once in 10 years.
Okay, last question. Patek Cubitus. Go.
I like it, it's okay. But that's the thing. People want a really inflamed reaction to it. And my answer is it's okay. I'm not really angry. I'm not really smitten. I think it's reasonably thin, fine, well made, impressive in the hand. And this is basically Patek saying we want to get into the Royal Oak Offshore size class. But aside from the 40th anniversary Nautilus chronograph, we just don't think that the Nautilus or the Aquanaut can get that big without diluting the model line. So they
Hmm.
built something that was a new model line to accommodate the guy who wants a 44, 45 millimeter watch.
Really?
I will also say, yeah, it would look better if they made it in tantalum with a
Mm.
matching tantalum bracelet. Imagine a purple metallic dial with a tantalum case and bracelet. Changes things, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly would be darker.
It would be a lot more intense and a lot more its own thing. The
Yeah.
problem is the 50
It's very Black Panther.
the 5821 the 5821 is a watch that in its green dial form looks a hell of a lot like the Nautilus 5711 1A14 from 2001.
Hmm.
It needs its own case metals. It needs its own dial colors. And what I think would make the watch line, like all of them, a lot stronger would be if every Cubitus had the big date complication from the 5822, the
Mm.
triple calendar. Like, I
Hmm.
feel like if instead of having three hands and a date at 3 o'clock, the 5821 had that double date, I think it would have a much stronger, unique identity. And I also think it's worth exploring the use of a strap more frequently on the
Mm.
basic automatic, because I
Sure.
think the watch would feel more like its own thing if it didn't have a bracelet so obviously related to the Nautilus.
Right.
Again, I'm suggesting things that you might see on like a second year or third year update. You got to
Right.
remember with the code 1159 from AP, everyone hated them initially. And then when they started to use gradient dials, ceramic and steel cases, they started to bring in enamel and lacquer dials with color fades, guilloche, steel cases. All of a sudden, people had a much more favorable opinion of it. Like right out of the gate, people thought that the complications were pretty good, the minute repeater, the tourbillon, the perpetual calendar. It was just that the automatic and the chrono year one had these really flat and monotone and expensive to make but cheap looking dials. And it
Right.
took all 12 months worth of consideration for AP to answer with some revisions. So I wouldn't be shocked if Cubitus is one of those collections that gets a lot better as we go along. I think that it's important to take collector opinion into account. And the fact that they've sold out all of these already means that they're going to have to go back and make more. And if you're going to make more from scratch, you may as well reconsider at the point of assembly whether you can create something with a stronger and more distinct identity. I would say they probably thought it was a safe play to tie it to an existing collection right out of the gate. Just like with the Code 1159, you got these hexagonal bolts all over the case, like the Royal Oak. You got this mid case that was a rounded octagon. And the idea was that by tying it to a successful product, you would sort of engender affection by association. Instead, no one noticed it and everyone was up in arms about the dial. And I think what people are really up in arms about with the Cubitus is the bracelet, which looks a lot like a Nautilus. If they were to go back and say, from now on, let's talk about purple dials and purple rubber straps. Let's talk about this being more of a strap monster than a bracelet watch. Let's talk about doing the bracelet with a little bit of different design and maybe try something really exotic like a tantalum bracelet, something that even FP Journe hasn't offered in series production yet.
Yeah.
So I think there's room to improve, and I'm more excited about what the Cubitus could become than I am about the initial steel and platinum models. So I think the people who are slamming it are making noise to get attention, and I think that people who are racing to buy it just because it's a steel Patek maybe haven't thoughtfully considered their decision.
Hmm.
I think the man in the middle is the guy who wants to wait and see
Yeah.
because I think this collection will improve over time.
I think that's a really, really, really good point because I think we're so emotional, about these things and we're so quick to judge and the knee-jerk reactions and such. I couldn't agree with you more. I think the short-sightedness of it all is, oh, this is it. This is all it'll ever be, as opposed to an evolution, to your 1159 point. And I myself, not an 1159 fan, wasn't on day one, still am not. However, my opinion has certainly swayed towards liking it more than I did. And I think to your point, the Cubitus is probably going to be that exact situation again, where its evolution will be better later than it is today. And I think that's like a really good point that people like should stop and think about. Like this isn't it. Like, I'd love to know that BMW is going to come full circle on that M5 because good God, it's awful and it's heavy.
It's very heavy, but I mean, I would say consider this. That power plant was previously only available in the XM. So
Right.
putting it in a reasonable car is a huge step forward. Now, the next step might be something along the lines of a CS or a competition. I don't
Hmm.
think they can do anything about the weight. I do think that they can change the dynamics a little bit. If you're able to take an inch out of the ride height, if you're able to go with spool valve shocks, if you're able to go with, urethane bushings, if you're able to make a much more committed and aggressive performance version of it, that will be a much more coherent car.
Sure.
They should probably just discontinue the standard M5 and only have the CS in the competition. And then
Mm.
if you want a luxurious 5 Series, you buy something else. You buy something that's a plug-in hybrid, or you buy something that's a six-cylinder. You don't bother with an M5 that is the minimum M5. You only sell the maximum
Hmm.
M5.
Yeah.
In terms of weight, I think there's room for the next M3 to maybe incorporate the best elements of this M5. Because if you look at it, what the M3 used to be is now the M3 is a sedan. It's relatively big. It's as heavy as a E39 5 Series.
Yep.
But the M2 is what the M3 used to be.
I think everybody agrees with you there, 100%.
I think that the next M3 could be what the M5 used to be.
It has to. Yeah.
Maybe that creates more space for the M5 to be, more of a power cruiser.
Hmm.
But I do think they'd be well advised if they're with this. I think it's what is it, F90 series now? this M5, if they just decide, okay, look, no one wants a basic M5. If a basic M5 is this heavy and this soft and this compromised, let's go for 900 horsepower. Let's go for urethane bushings. Let's go for, spool valve shocks. Let's go for carbon fiber wheels. Let's go for carbon fiber bracing in the chassis. Let's lower the center of gravity 25 millimeters. Let's, maybe even focus on doing a car that's all engine. And I think it would be perfectly acceptable to cut power down to 600. We don't need 700 plus. If all that's going to the rear wheels and you can chop 450 pounds out of the car, I'd
Right.
sign up for that in a second. I don't think that's impossible. And with no follow-up to the XM reportedly being made, I think that Motorsport has the budget to make a purely rear-wheel drive, turbocharged, direct injected, V8 powered M5. And I think you could put a big price on that and get it. I think
Yeah.
the kind of guy who's waiting on his GT3 allocation at Porsche would jump ship to get an M5 that's all motor, rear-wheel drive, and 400 to 500 pounds lighter than the current M5. So two
Sure.
different ways they could go. They could make it a lot more hardcore with a CS or a competition, or they could decide that, look, we're just going rear wheel drive, all engine. We're pulling out the starternator, we're pulling out the battery packs, we're pulling out the electric motors, and we're just going to go with a 8-speed automatic from ZF. And power goes to the rear. And this is going to be something that we design with the money that we were going to put into the next generation XM that no one wants.
Yeah. Tim, thank you, man. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate you coming back on the show. It's been, well, by the time this comes out, it's not 100 episodes later, but, pretty freaking close. And it's been too long. It's been too long.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sorry I rambled this time. I was so much more focused when we first did the interview.
No, this is great. Like it's like a toy that what are the cars you pull back and then you let them go?
The Darta cars.
That's Tim Mosso on this episode of the Standard Age podcast. I love it. I love it.
Thank you so much, Wesley. It's been my pleasure. Let's not wait 100 episodes before we do this again.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully after Dubai, right? Okay, buddy. We'll chat soon. This wraps up this episode of the Standard Age podcast. If you like what you heard, I'd love it if you'd share it with a friend or two. And if you have a moment, please rate and review the show as it helps others discover these episodes. It absolutely helps far more than you realize. Shout out to Jensen Reed and Super Beautiful for the theme track. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.